Luzon, Philippines, January 1945. Just before dawn, the jungle holds its breath. A narrow trench snakes through a ravine. Inside it, hunched and silent, are over 100 Japanese soldiers. Mud-streaked helmets, bayonets fixed, knuckles tight on their Arisaka rifles. Above them, thick canopy blots out the pale sky. They listen. American artillery has been pounding the ridgeline all night. But now, there's a pause, a stillness. No whistles, no explosions, just the damp hiss of morning mist drifting through leaves. Then suddenly, a thud. Not in the trees, not on the ground, above. A split second later, the air erupts. Shells are bursting mid-air, not on impact, but suspended like invisible knives in the sky. Razor-hot steel rains down in all directions. Shrapnel slices through bamboo, bone, helmets, lungs. There is nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Some scream. Most don't. By the time the American infantry arrives an hour later, all that's left are silent trenches filled with still bodies, untouched by craters, but shredded by death from above. The Japanese had dug in for a fight. They never saw the Fuzes coming. When World War II began in 1939, artillery was already known as the king of the battlefield. From the flat plains of Poland to the frozen forests of Finland, heavy guns ruled the tempo of war. They were crude, powerful, and often imprecise. But they had reach. When infantry couldn't move forward, artillery cleared the path. But even as new tanks, planes, and automatic weapons dominated headlines, artillery technology lagged behind. The cannons were strong, the shells were lethal, but the fuses, the small metal devices that triggered detonation, were still bound by 19th century logic. At the heart of every artillery shell was its fuse, and in the early war years, armies relied primarily on two kinds: impact fuses and mechanical time delay fuses. Impact fuses were simple. When a shell hit something solid, a wall, a tank, the ground, it exploded. Brutal. But this posed a problem, especially in jungle or forest terrain. The shell had to strike something. Missed the trench by a meter? Wasted. Landed in soft mud? Less lethal. Time delay fuses attempted a workaround. Using a mechanical timer, gunners could set the shell to explode after a certain number of seconds in flight. The goal? Detonate above the enemy, ideally in the air, spraying shrapnel downward. The theory was sound. In practice, it was unreliable. Artillery crews had to estimate range, calculate angle, and hope the timing matched the shell's arc. In the chaos of battle, with variables like wind, elevation, and terrain, time delay airbursts were as likely to go off too early, too late, or not at all. Still, these were the tools Allied and Axis forces brought into battle. Nowhere did these limitations become more lethal or more frustrating than in the Pacific Theater. By 1942, U.S. Marines and Army troops were engaging the Japanese in dense island jungles across Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and the Philippines. The Japanese defense strategy was brutally effective. Dig deep, move at night, ambush from cover, and fight to the death. Their infantry fought in foxholes, ravines, caves, and thick undergrowth, making it nearly impossible for traditional artillery to eliminate them before infantry arrived. American gunners quickly realized something. They could hear the enemy. They could see their own shells land, but they couldn't connect the two. Thousands of rounds fell harmlessly into trees, bounced off canopy, or embedded in soft jungle floor without detonating close to Japanese positions. When they did explode, impact shells only tore up the earth, while the defenders shielded underground emerged unharmed. Time delay fuses helped somewhat, but calibrating them in real-time jungle warfare proved nearly impossible. Seconds too early, and the shell burst harmlessly above treetops. Too late, and it exploded in the dirt. As one Marine artillery officer later put it, "We were firing blind. The jungle made every shot a question mark." On the receiving end, Japanese infantry tactics were unforgiving. both to the enemy and to themselves. Imperial Japanese Army doctrine prioritized spiritual willpower, discipline, and sacrifice. Mass charges, ambushes, and night attacks were common. Defensive positions were engineered to resist until the last man. Unlike the Nazis, the Japanese rarely surrendered. They fought to the bitter end. This meant artillery needed to do more than suppress. It had to kill. But if your shells couldn't reach the trenches, and your fuses couldn't detonate overhead, your guns might as well be throwing rocks. The US began to understand this at Tarawa, November 1943, where 3 days of naval and artillery bombardment failed to dislodge Japanese defenders who emerged from underground bunkers after the smoke cleared. Tarawa was a wake-up call, and American scientists had been quietly working on the answer, one that didn't just rely on timing or luck, one that could sense the enemy's presence and explode with precision before it ever touched the ground. Back in the United States, even before Pearl Harbor, scientists had been chasing a radical idea. What if a fuse could detect its target automatically? This was the birth of the proximity fuse. Under the highest classification level, engineers at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Lab, along with Navy and Army collaborators, began developing an artillery fuse that contained a miniature radar system. When the shell approached a solid object, the ground, a plane, or troops, the radar would sense the increasing proximity and trigger the explosion at the deadliest altitude, mid-air. But there was a problem. Actually, several. To work, the fuse had to survive 20,000 Gs of acceleration when fired, resist intense heat, vibration, and spin, operate on a small battery that wouldn't activate until firing, and never fall into enemy hands. Ever. The fear was that if Germany or Japan captured even a single intact VT, variable time fuse, they could reverse engineer it, or worse, develop electronic countermeasures. Because of this, VT fuses were initially banned from use in Europe over land. Only over the ocean, where wreckage would sink, were they authorized. The Navy was the first to deploy them, with terrifying results. By mid-1944, the US Army began issuing proximity fuses for field artillery, first in limited numbers, then at industrial scale. Entire shells were being manufactured not with mechanical gears, but with electronics, vacuum tubes, miniature transceivers, and sealed components. And unlike the old impact or timed versions, these fuses didn't guess. They knew. The variable time fuse, or VT fuse, as it became known, was a marvel of wartime engineering. Packed into the nose of an artillery shell was a fully self-contained miniature radio transmitter, receiver, amplifier, and battery system. The circuit operated like a tiny radar station. As the shell flew through the air, it emitted radio waves. When those waves hit an object, a plane wing, the ground, or more terrifyingly, a group of soldiers, they bounced back. That echo triggered the fuse, detonating the shell at the optimal killing distance. It didn't matter if the shell hit something or not. The shell could sense how close it was. That made it the first artillery fuse in history to think before exploding. By early 1943, the technology was real, but the stakes were enormous. The British and Americans immediately declared the VT fuse one of the most sensitive military secrets of the war, on par with the atomic bomb. Allied troops were instructed to never let one fall into enemy hands intact. If that meant destroying an entire artillery battery to prevent capture, so be it. In Europe, this meant restrictions. In the Pacific, it meant opportunity. The first real battlefield deployment came from the US Navy, who had suffered devastating losses from Japanese kamikaze attacks in 1944. Traditional anti-aircraft shells often missed fast-moving planes. Gunners had to aim, fire, and hope the timing was right. With kamikazes diving at 400 miles per hour, guesses weren't good enough. So the Navy loaded their 5-inch guns with VT fuses and watched the skies change. For the first time, shells exploded in midair as they neared enemy aircraft, not after hitting them. The kill rate skyrocketed. Entire waves of kamikazes were broken apart mid-dive, long before they reached American carriers. Destroyers that might have suffered 10 hits now suffered none. A U.S. Navy report later stated, "The VT Fuse did more to save American lives in the Pacific than any other piece of technology short of radar." By the end of 1944, the Navy was all in. Over 1.5 million VT fuses were manufactured by December, many by female factory workers trained to solder and assemble high-precision electronics by hand. The Pacific had become a proving ground for invisible science. For months, the Army had watched the Navy's results with envy. Artillerymen on land wanted what the sailors had: mid-air detonation, increased kill zones, and the ability to destroy dug-in enemy positions with surgical efficiency. But there were complications. Unlike at sea, shells fired on land could leave behind unexploded components, including the precious fuse, which risked being found by the enemy. Japanese engineers, though less advanced in electronics, were still capable of disassembling captured weapons. So the War Department waited. It wasn't until late 1944, when American ground forces were firmly on the offensive across multiple islands, that the Army authorized selective field deployment of VT fuses for artillery. Their first combat trial? The Battle of Leyte, Philippines, November 1944. American troops were fighting a brutal campaign to retake the island from a deeply entrenched Japanese garrison. The jungle was thick, rain was constant, foxholes were everywhere. VT-fused shells were loaded quietly into 105mm and 155mm howitzers stationed behind the front lines. Few infantries even knew they existed. Gunners were given strict orders to recover all fragments, and officers kept records locked. The results were staggering. For the first time, Japanese ambush squads were being cut down before they could fire. Entire trench lines were neutralized by airbursts that exploded directly over their heads. Shells no longer needed direct hits, they killed by proximity. In official after-action reports, field commanders described stunned responses. "We saw foxholes with no sign of explosion nearby, yet everyone inside was dead." The shelling seemed supernatural. It burst where it should not have. The effect on Japanese morale was chilling. Unlike bombs or rockets, the VT fuse gave no telltale whistle, no visible trigger, no crater. There was no incoming moment. Just a thud, and then hell from above. To Japanese infantry trained to hide in cover and survive bombardment, it was disorienting, even terrifying. Veteran soldiers began to fear tree cover and trench walls, unsure if safety meant survival anymore. At Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, VT fuses were increasingly used to clear out bunkers, forest ambushes, and even cave mouths. Gunners learned to fire shells just over the tree line, letting the radar sensors do the rest. One Army artillery officer later recalled, "It turned the jungle against them." What had protected them for years now became a trap by mid-1945. American production of VT fuses exceeded 22 million units, built by a network of secret contractors across the U.S. Entire trains were filled with proximity shells headed for the Pacific. And yet, the Japanese never developed a counter. They never even knew what they were fighting against. To the average Japanese soldier, it wasn't radar. It wasn't electronics. It was death from above, without warning, without logic, without mercy. For over 2 years, Japanese infantry had relied on the terrain to shield them. Thick jungle, winding ravines, and cleverly dug positions had frustrated Allied advances time and again. But the VT fuse changed the rules of war. It eliminated the one advantage terrain had offered: cover. Every tree became a liability. Every trench became a death box, and every American shell became a hunter, scanning the air, waiting to strike. For the average Japanese infantryman in 1944, the most feared sound was no longer the shriek of a dive bomber or the roar of a flamethrower. It was silence. Then, the sudden, thunderous detonation above. Veterans of earlier Pacific battles had grown familiar with American artillery. They knew its rhythm, its power, and its flaws. They learned to time the lulls, read the terrain, and take cover deep in the earth. A well-built foxhole could mean the difference between life and death. But with the arrival of proximity-fused shells, that equation shattered. Now the most experienced soldiers, those who had survived Guadalcanal, Bougainville, or New Guinea, were the ones most likely to be taken first. Why? Because they followed training. They dug deep, they stayed put, and the shells no longer needed to hit them. A VT fuse didn't care if a soldier was hidden. It didn't care about trees, or camouflage, or trenches. It only needed to get close, and then the air itself turned lethal. The burst came 5 to 10 meters above ground, exploding outward in a horizontal cone of razor-sharp steel fragments at over 3,000 feet per second. A foxhole became a trap. A trench became a coffin. Interrogations of captured Japanese soldiers in late 1944 and early 1945 revealed confusion, fear, and increasing superstition. Some believed the Americans had developed a way to see through the trees, or that they were using aircraft to guide their shells in mid-flight. One captured lieutenant, recovered after the Battle of Luzon, simply said, "It was as if the sky could see us." The jungle had long been the great equalizer in the Pacific War. For the Japanese army, trained in close-quarters combat and spiritual discipline, it was an ally. It concealed movements, absorbed bombardment, and allowed ambushes that devastated American patrols. Infantrymen could disappear into palm thickets, strike hard, then vanish. American planners had learned this the hard way. At Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Peleliu, U.S. troops advanced yard by yard, bleeding for every trench. Pre-invasion bombardments often proved ineffective, too short, too imprecise, or simply absorbed by earthworks and foliage. But the tactical game changed the moment VT fuses entered the field. American artillery commanders began designing fire missions not to hit enemy positions, but to bracket them from above. Instead of aiming for structures or trails, gunners focused on airspace, 20 meters above tree line, 50 meters in front of the forward line. And with VT fuses, that space became deadly. This allowed for what was effectively a curtain of air-burst steel, a line of exploding shells that could blanket enemy-held terrain without the need for pinpoint accuracy. Entire valleys, forest paths, and ridgelines became no-go zones. At Iwo Jima, U.S., Marines reported that Japanese forces abandoned entire sectors of their tunnel networks, not because of collapse or fire, but because repeated airbursts made surfacing anywhere a fatal risk. Forward observers began coordinating with infantry in real time. If patrols spotted movement, they called in proximity artillery, not to strike the spot, but to saturate the surrounding sky. Even evasive units that scattered were often caught by the expanding lethal radius. Artillery units using VT fuses often quadrupled their effective kill radius compared to traditional impact shells. What made the tactic even more devastating was its psychological impact on command decisions. Japanese officers could no longer rely on night cover. Moving troops under canopy, assembling counterattacks, or preparing defensive lines became increasingly dangerous. Even if the Americans couldn't see them, they could fire into the air above them and achieve results. This degraded Japanese unit cohesion. Platoons became isolated, orders delayed, counterattacks failed to form. Infantrymen stayed in place, terrified of exposing their position, only to be struck down by airbursts targeting general zones, not individuals. Even the famed banzai charges, a hallmark of Imperial Japanese resistance, began to collapse. Historically, these mass suicide attacks relied on shock, speed, and the element of surprise, often launched at night or during lulls in American fire. But with VT fuses, U.S. gunners could break up a charge before it came within rifle range, exploding shells above the formation, sending panic and steel through the ranks. At the Battle of Luzon, one such charge was halted mid-run. Survivors reported that they never reached the American line. They were killed by invisible shrapnel from above. In war, tactics often evolve over months, sometimes years. But the introduction of proximity-fused artillery created a seismic shift in battlefield logic in a matter of weeks. It gave American units the ability to deny terrain without direct engagement, break up formations before visual contact, neutralize cover that had once protected the enemy, maintain constant fire superiority, even in defensive posture. The Japanese army, for all its resilience, had no answer. They had no counterfuse, no jamming technology, no radar. Their doctrine had been built around terrain advantage and infantry courage. But courage couldn't stop shrapnel from the clouds, and as the Americans advanced across the Philippines and into Okinawa, the VT fuse became more than a weapon. It became a signal that no place was safe, that even the sky had turned against them. To understand why the variable time fuse was so devastating, we must understand what it was and what it survived. Each VT fuse was a miniature machine, barely larger than a light bulb, yet engineered to survive the most violent forces any object had ever endured and still functioned perfectly. When fired from a howitzer or naval gun, the shell experienced acceleration exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity, enough to liquefy bone, rupture steel, or destroy most electronics. And yet, inside this projectile was a delicate radar system. The fuse consisted of 4 critical components: a radio transmitter that emitted continuous pulses as the shell flew, a receiver that measured the echo returning from nearby objects, an amplifier and signal processor to calculate proximity, a detonator, primed to explode at the ideal lethal range. All of this was powered by a vacuum-activated battery, triggered only after the shell left the gun barrel, ensuring the fuse remained inert until it was safely airborne. To build such a system in the early 1940s was nothing short of miraculous. At a time when most electronics were bulky, fragile, and hand-wired, the VT fuse required miniaturization, shock-proofing, and reliability under conditions few had ever tested. The result? A fuse that made decisions in mid-air. A thinking shell. The heart of the system was a miniature vacuum tube, a glass-encased amplifier the size of a thimble. These tubes were redesigned from scratch to withstand extreme pressure, heat, and centrifugal spin. Factories across the United States retooled production lines to meet demand. RCA, Western Electric, and dozens of subcontractors trained workers, many of them women, to solder fragile circuits with military precision. Each VT fuse required complex quality control, and failed components were destroyed to avoid leaks. By 1945, production hit 40,000 units per day, with over 22 million VT fuses manufactured by the end of the war. And yet, not one was ever captured intact by the Japanese. Not one was reverse-engineered. The secret held. The fuse's first test was survival. Its second was detection. Its final purpose, destruction, precisely when needed. Technology can change the battlefield. But what the VT fuse did to the mind was far more profound. From the earliest jungle clashes, Japanese infantry relied on routine. They understood the American approach. Bombardment, pause, advance. They knew the cadence of shells, the safety of trenches, the value of silence. They had survived Peleliu, Guadalcanal, and the Philippines because they'd learned to read the signs. But the VT fuse erased every rule they had lived by. Shells no longer exploded on impact. They no longer gave warning. The artillery no longer aimed at you. It simply aimed above and let science find you. Survivors began to whisper of cursed shells, of American shells that hunted men, of ghost fire from the clouds. Captured Japanese field journals recovered at Iwo Jima and Luzon tell a chilling story. In one entry dated March 1945, a corporal wrote. We buried them where they lay. They had no wounds, but their faces were gone. The trees had rained blades. Another diary, translated after the Battle of Okinawa, read, Even in the cave we are not safe. The walls shudder. Air explodes without reason. They fire without seeing us. And yet we die. These were not exaggerations. The VT fuse fundamentally altered the psychological contract of warfare. It stripped defenders of the last illusion of control. Foxholes, once sacred. Trenches, once safe. Silence, once a shield. All betrayed them. The brilliance of the VT fuse was not only in its lethality, but in its invisibility. Japanese soldiers could not hear the difference between a normal shell and a proximity-fused one. The shell still sounded the same in flight. There was no glowing light, no new shape, no sound of arming. This meant they had no warning, no adaptation, no ritual or command could save them from it. And once word spread, it became mental warfare. Reports from American commanders noted reduced Japanese resistance after sustained use of VT-fused barrages. Defensive positions were abandoned more quickly. Banzai charges decreased. Captured soldiers reported fears that the Americans controlled the sky even without planes. In one instance during the Battle of Luzon, a Japanese officer and 10 soldiers surrendered, a rare event in the Pacific theater, after experiencing a repeated barrage of airburst shells. They hadn't been wounded. They had simply broken. By the spring of 1945, the proximity fuse had altered not just tactics, but psychology. It shortened battles, it suppressed resistance, it collapsed morale. It was never seen by the enemy, never recovered from the battlefield, and to most who died beneath its blast, they never knew why. It began with thunder. On January 9, 1945, the U.S. Sixth Army landed on the western shores of Luzon, the largest and most strategically vital island in the Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur, fulfilling his promise to return, commanded over 175,000 American troops, supported by hundreds of naval guns, aircraft, and artillery batteries. Facing them were nearly 275,000 Japanese defenders, entrenched, determined, and suicidal in their resistance. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the infamous Tiger of Malaya, had transformed the mountainous terrain into a fortress of caves, ridges, and ambush points. He did not intend to win. He intended to bleed the Americans. But Yamashita had not yet met the VT fuse. As U.S. infantry pushed inland from the Lingayen Gulf, they encountered exactly what they feared: layered jungle defenses, sniper nests, and well-hidden trench lines. The first week was slow. Casualties were high. Airstrikes couldn't reach into the dense canopy, and conventional artillery again proved frustrating. Shells exploded too late, or harmlessly soaked into the jungle floor. Then came the order: deploy the VT fuses. The first units authorized to fire them were part of the 37th Infantry Division. Stationed along the approaches to the Agno River, they were assigned the task of clearing a dense valley known to contain entrenched Japanese machine gun crews and forward observers. On January 17th, after a short adjustment period, fire orders were issued. American 105mm howitzers fired a rolling barrage, not at bunkers, not at trails, but above the trees. What happened next was recorded in detail by the division's artillery commander, Colonel Frank Sullivan. We fired 400 rounds with VT fuses over a 900-yard front. Every shell burst in the air, between 20 and 40 feet above the jungle line. The result was immediate. Movement stopped. All radio intercepts from enemy positions ceased. Our infantry moved in unopposed. When troops advanced into the valley, they found a scene almost untouched by conventional signs of battle. No large craters, no flattened buildings. And yet, scores of Japanese soldiers lay dead in trenches, under trees, beside foxholes. Many were killed instantly by fragmentation from above, never having fired a shot. In the days that followed, American artillery expanded its use of proximity fuses across multiple sectors. At San Manuel, where Japanese tanks and infantry attempted a rare coordinated defense, VT-fused shells destroyed soft infantry positions before the armor even advanced. The result: disorganized retreat, abandoned vehicles, and fractured communications. By the end of January, entire American divisions had adjusted their fire doctrines. Forward observers no longer called for targeted fire. Instead, they requested airburst curtains, firing over suspected enemy locations, jungle paths, and even river crossings, denying space itself. The Japanese, recognizing the shift, attempted to adapt. They dug deeper, stayed longer underground, and attempted to move at night. But even these tactics failed. American batteries began round-the-clock bombardments, targeting rest zones and supply routes with proximity shells. It wasn't just about killing anymore. It was about breaking time itself, denying the enemy the ability to move, sleep, or prepare. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese banzai charges had symbolized the brutal resolve of an army that refused surrender. On Saipan, entire regiments had rushed American lines in suicidal last stands. At Peleliu, final charges had caused devastating American casualties. But at Luzon, the banzai charge died, not in blood, but in vapor. In mid-February, an intercepted Japanese order from a regional commander urged his battalion to prepare for a final assault. American intelligence knew it was coming. They didn't wait. Using captured map sketches, U.S. artillery targeted the likely assembly points the night before the planned charge. VT-fused shells were fired in repeating volleys across a 1,000-yard slope. There was no charge the next day. Only silence. Scouts later found over 150 bodies, grouped in tight clusters, slain before they ever reached the line of departure. It was no longer a fight of wills. It was an execution, before the enemy even began to fight. By March, Yamashita's forces were retreating deeper into the Cordillera Mountains, fractured, starving, and isolated. Despite still holding numerical superiority in some sectors, Japanese resistance began to fade. Entire positions were abandoned at the rumor of proximity shelling. Some soldiers buried themselves alive to avoid the sky. Others refused to move after sundown. And in some cases, American infantry captured bunkers where weapons had been left behind, but the soldiers had fled, not from fire, but from fear. This wasn't just a tactical shift. This was total psychological dominance, achieved not through numbers, but through science. For on another island, where the last great battle of the Pacific awaited, the sky would open again. And this time, it would explode over the blood-soaked cliffs of Okinawa. It was the final invasion, the bloodiest campaign the United States would fight in the Pacific War, and the last time the VT fuse would fully reveal its terrifying potential. The Battle of Okinawa, beginning on April 1, 1945, was meant to open the doorway to Japan itself. Just 340 miles from the home islands, Okinawa was defended by over 100,000 Japanese troops, including elite imperial units, artillery, and the fanatically loyal Boei-Tai militia. The island was honeycombed with fortifications, cliffs, and underground tunnels. Japanese defenders had learned from Saipan, Peleliu, and Luzon. They knew better than to contest the beaches. Instead, they let the Americans land. Then they waited. In the coming weeks, over 183,000 U.S. troops would be drawn into a storm of suicide attacks, cave defenses, and relentless resistance. The terrain favored the defender, and every meter gained would cost blood. But this time, the Americans had brought a weapon that the Japanese had still not fully understood: VT-fused artillery in massive quantities. At the heart of Okinawa stood the Shuri Line, a 3-mile-wide fortified belt of ridges, caves, and overlapping fields of fire. Japanese defenders dug in for a final stand, believing they could delay the U.S. invasion by months, if not forever. American commanders knew better. They weren't just going to shell the bunkers, they were going to kill the space above them. The 10th Army, under General Buckner, deployed hundreds of artillery pieces, 105mm and 155mm howitzers, 8-inch guns, and even naval fire from battleships offshore. Many of these guns were now loaded with proximity fuses. Starting in mid-April, artillery brigades began launching continuous VT-fused barrages over Japanese positions. Instead of cratered soil, they left shattered trees, burning brush, and, most terrifying to the enemy, no visible damage to their structures, but complete annihilation of the men inside them. Observers noted that tree cover disintegrated within hours. Troop movements became impossible. Communications lines were severed not by shell impacts, but by the sheer volume of shrapnel bursting mid-air. It was a new kind of saturation, not just of explosive force, but of atmosphere. The air itself became a weapon. Japanese strategy relied on caves and tunnels, often connected through narrow passageways with firing slits and escape routes. It had worked on Iwo Jima, where General Kuribayashi's defense inflicted over 26,000 American casualties. But on Okinawa, those same caves became tombs. American gunners began calibrating VT shells to burst at the mouth of known cave systems. With radar guidance, they could detonate rounds just outside the entrance, sending hot steel ricocheting into confined spaces. Entire platoons were vaporized inside their own defenses. When infantry tried to emerge under cover of darkness or fog, VT rounds were fired not at them, but into the sky above their paths. Shrapnel descended like invisible blades, slicing through flesh and discipline alike. In one recorded incident, a Japanese night counterattack was destroyed before it even cleared the ridgeline. Survivors reported no sound of incoming shells, only the sudden burst of light and the whine of steel. Bodies lay scattered across the hillside, untouched by craters. To the Americans watching through binoculars, it was ghostly. To the Japanese, it was unkillable fire. By mid-May, the sheer dominance of VT-fused artillery began to change how American commanders thought about warfare. They no longer needed visual confirmation to call in fire. They only needed a grid square, a suspected position, a pattern of footprints. And that was enough. Entire hills were blanketed in air-burst barrages, not to destroy structures, but to ensure no one could occupy them. Forward movement became a methodical clearing of territory not by clash, but by absence, as if artillery had exorcised the battlefield before infantry even arrived. In declassified reports from the 77th Infantry Division, observers noted that VT shelling created a phenomenon they called silent conquest. No fire returned, no movement visible, yet the enemy is gone. This was a level of control never before seen in land warfare, not suppression, not destruction, erasure. As Japanese lines collapsed under the weight of VT-fused shelling, desperation took over. Commanders ordered children and elderly militia to mount suicide charges. Civilian casualties soared. The shattered remains of regiments were ordered to fight to the last, often cornered in cave systems already bracketed by American gunners. On June 18th, General Buckner was killed by enemy fire, but by then the battle was already over. American artillery had rendered most Japanese strongpoints irrelevant. Those who survived were either too wounded, too isolated, or too broken to fight. On June 22, 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa ended. It had taken 82 days, over 12,000 American lives, and 100,000 Japanese dead. But the VT fuse had proven itself, not just as a weapon of precision, but of pressure. Relentless, invisible, and psychological pressure. A battlefield ghost that no man could predict or survive. When Okinawa fell, it wasn't because the Americans stormed every cave. It wasn't because they overwhelmed every position. It was because nowhere was safe. The ground was deadly. The sky was worse. When the guns fell silent in June 1945, the world didn't yet understand what had just happened. The headlines focused on troop numbers, territory gained, and casualties suffered. The death toll on Okinawa was staggering. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians, nearly 50,000 US casualties, and entire sections of the island scorched beyond recognition. But hidden beneath the statistics was a deeper truth. The United States had deployed a weapon that changed the fundamental nature of firepower. The variable time, VT fuse, had not just won engagements, it had altered the psychological and structural foundations of battlefield resistance. It wasn't merely a bomb upgrade, it was an atmospheric presence, a ghost in the trees, a blade in the air. And for the Japanese, there was no countermeasure, no answer, no recovery. Throughout the entire Pacific Theater, not a single intact VT fuse fell into Japanese hands. This was by design. From the outset, the US military enforced an unprecedented secrecy protocol around VT fuse usage. Every shell fired was tracked, every dud recovered. Artillery officers were instructed to destroy damaged units before withdrawal, and frontline troops were ordered never to discuss the shell's effects with civilians or the press. The Japanese, for their part, observed the consequences but never understood the cause. Captured soldiers spoke of air shells and exploding winds, but no accurate descriptions of the fuse itself ever emerged. Japanese engineers, despite their ingenuity, lacked access to high-frequency radar components, shock-proof vacuum tubes, or the transistor-level miniaturization required to build such a device. It wasn't just a technology gap, it was a generational chasm in electronic warfare, and the US had quietly crossed it while the rest of the world fought with steel and powder. A weapon that outproduced its secrets. The true scale of the VT fuse effort is still staggering. By the end of World War II, over 22 million proximity fuses had been produced by the US. More than 200 factories and research centers contributed to the program. Over 40,000 workers were involved in assembly and testing. Each fuse cost roughly $18, expensive by wartime standards, but priceless in effectiveness. The design was constantly refined. Early models, sensitive to weather and elevation, were improved with new vacuum tubes, longer-lasting batteries, and more reliable transmitters. Some versions could be tuned for specific burst altitudes, while others were optimized for low-angle fire or anti-personnel roles. Naval shells, field artillery, rockets, and even anti-aircraft rounds were soon fused with proximity systems. By August 1945, the United States had the ability to completely suppress enemy movement across entire regions, without direct visual contact, without air support, and without the need for overwhelming troop presence. The Japanese, battered, starving, and without access to comparable technology, had lost the ability to maneuver, to regroup, and ultimately to resist. In the Pacific, American firepower had always outmatched the Japanese, but firepower alone had never guaranteed success. At Peleliu, US troops suffered horrendous losses despite days of naval bombardment. At Tarawa, entrenched Japanese units withstood air and sea firepower and still inflicted nearly 3,000 American casualties in 76 hours. What changed with the VT fuse was efficiency, not just in lethality, but in area denial, suppression, and psychological collapse. With proximity artillery, the US no longer needed direct hits. It no longer needed line of sight. And in many cases, it no longer even needed to fight. Enemy strongpoints were emptied before contact. Jungle ambushes were neutralized before they began. Counterattacks were shattered in staging areas, invisible before they were even real. In military after-action reviews following Luzon and Okinawa, officers noted, "The VT fuse increased artillery effectiveness by a factor of 5, particularly against personnel in cover. This was not an improvement in shell power, it was a transformation in engagement doctrine." Terrain no longer mattered. Jungle, ridge, bunker, all became equally exposed. The Japanese had planned to bleed the Americans in every foot of ground. But the VT fuse took away the ground itself. As American planners reviewed the results of Okinawa, the statistics told a clear story. Wherever proximity fuses were deployed, Japanese resistance durations shortened significantly. Casualties per square kilometer dropped for American infantry. Japanese surrenders, though still rare, increased, particularly in areas heavily shelled with VT munitions. By late July 1945, with Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan's home islands, on the horizon, American logistics were rapidly accelerating VT fuse production. Millions of shells were being stockpiled in anticipation of what would have been the bloodiest invasion in human history. But then, 2 atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The VT fuse, overshadowed in the public eye by the flash of nuclear fire, remained largely hidden. But for those who had fought on Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, it was understood. The war had been won not just with ships and planes, but with an unseen explosion in the air. The shell that killed without warning. The fuse that redefined combat. Though World War II ended with the blinding flash of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, military historians and weapons developers knew a quieter revolution had already occurred, in the air above the battlefield, long before the atom split. The VT fuse, born in the labs of America's wartime science elite, had transformed artillery from a brute force hammer into a precision psychological scalpel. Its impact did not end in 1945. It only expanded. After Japan's surrender, the tight veil of secrecy surrounding the VT fuse slowly lifted. What had once been classified above the Manhattan Project in strategic importance was now revealed to military planners worldwide. The U.S. Army, Navy, and Air Force immediately began integrating the fuse into standard munitions stockpiles. No longer limited to elite field units or naval gunners, VT-fused shells became available to artillery schools, NATO partners, and post-war arsenals. New variants were developed for anti-aircraft guns, defending against jet bombers, surface-to-air missiles, early Nike missile systems, naval CIWS and flak guns, rocket artillery, and mortars. The Cold War arms race did not wait for tanks to meet on planes. It was fought in the silent precision of electronics. And the VT fuse had already taught one powerful lesson. He who controls the sky, not with planes, but with airbursts, controls the earth. Just 5 years after Okinawa, American forces would again face mass infantry assaults, this time on the frozen hills of Korea. Chinese forces, often in battalion-sized waves, charged across open terrain at night, using numbers to overwhelm defenders. In early battles like the Chosin Reservoir, U.S. units were frequently outnumbered 5-1 or more, but they had something the Chinese did not expect. Proximity-fused shells. American artillery units deployed VT rounds in bulk, targeting not just formations, but paths of approach, likely assembly zones and open slopes. Gunners no longer needed to guess where the enemy was. They just needed to know where they were going. The result? Entire charges were broken before contact. Chinese infantry, advancing by the thousands, often collapsed under rolling waves of overhead fragmentation, sometimes never seeing the enemy they intended to attack. Veterans of Korea reported that VT artillery saved more American lives than any other single battlefield system, outside of close air support. The lessons of the Pacific had returned, in colder soil, under a different flag, but with the same sky exploding above the battlefield. Today, proximity fuses are standard in nearly every advanced military force. While modern versions no longer use vacuum tubes or basic radar, the principle remains unchanged. A shell that senses its environment and detonates when it can do the most damage. Modern adaptations include laser proximity fuses for ultra-precise altitude burst, multispectral seekers for distinguishing targets from terrain, programmable airburst munitions for infantry rifles, e.g., the US XM-25, Anti-drone proximity weapons used in naval and urban defense artillery fire doctrines across NATO, Russia, China, and emerging powers incorporate lessons first learned in the Pacific. Suppression doesn't require vision. Airbursts can deny terrain. Psychological impact is as valuable as kinetic force. Cover is no longer a guarantee of survival. The ghost that haunted Luzon and Okinawa now lives inside microchips, satellites, and smart bombs. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the VT fuse isn't technological, it's philosophical. Before 1943, artillery was still seen through a World War I lens. Firepower for destruction, barrages for suppression, numbers for results. After the fuse, firepower became smart. It became selective, area-denying, terrain-aware, and, most importantly, psychologically dominant. Military commanders began asking new questions. How do you destroy not just the body, but the will? How do you win before contact? How do you weaponize space, not just impact? The VT fuse wasn't just an innovation in explosives, it was an innovation in thought. Despite its profound impact, the VT fuse remains one of the least-known stories of World War II to the general public. Its use was invisible, its effects were misunderstood, and its credit was often lost in the shadows of tanks, bombers, and atomic fire. But for those who fought, and for those who died beneath skies that suddenly turned against them, it was unforgettable. It marked the beginning of a new era. A war where the most lethal weapon wasn't seen, where the air itself had been armed, and where, for the first time, man learned to fire a shell that knew when to kill. In war, there are weapons we remember: the thunder of tanks at Kursk, the screech of dive bombers over Stalingrad, the mushroom cloud rising over Hiroshima. These images sear themselves into memory. They have sound, they have scale, they carry myth. But there are other revolutions, quieter ones, that reshape war just as completely. The VT fuse did not roar, it did not shine, it did not move in parades or drop from bomb bays. It simply whispered in the air and detonated with precision, in silence, above the heads of those who never saw it coming. It was the first time man had created a weapon that sensed its surroundings, a shell that waited, calculated, and chose when to kill. No longer dependent on impact or guesswork, it hovered in that final instant between physics and intention, and rewrote what artillery meant. To the Japanese soldiers on Luzon, it was invisible death. To the Marines on Okinawa, it was a miracle of survival. To the scientists who built it, it was proof that radar and circuitry could change the face of ground war. And to history, it was the moment the battlefield began to think for itself. We often say that modern warfare began with the atom bomb, but in truth, it began before that, when engineers taught an artillery shell to listen, to know, to choose. Since that day, no soldier has looked at the sky the same way again.